Hello and welcome. This is Direct Talk. On today's session, we'll be discussing UN Internet Forum in Ethiopia. I'm joined by Teklay Gebremichael. He's an editor in Tigray media, a media that is working in documenting atrocities committed in the war on Tigray. Teklay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Abid, for having me on.
Okay, first, let's start with your reaction. What did you feel when you just learned the news that Ethiopia is hosting the UN Internet Forum?
Before I start answering your question, can I express my appreciation to Tigray TV? I know that you've been working in extremely difficult circumstances for the past 2 years. There have been attempts by the Ethiopian and Eritrean regimes to take you off air, to shut it down, and to destroy your equipment and everything. And I understand the enormous difficulty that you have had to put up with, and to be able to continue being voice of your people in the face of insurmountable difficulties is something, and I would like to say thank you, but also you have really humbled us in your extraordinary determination to keep going. And this is just an example of the Tigrayan resilience, and I'm so proud of Tigray TV. So my reaction to the Internet Governance Forum decided to hold its annual conference in Ethiopia was one of anger, just like every sensible person, like every Tigrayan. I was shocked and I was angered that they decided to host it in Ethiopia. The Internet Governance Forum is a UN body, and its task is to arrange forums and platforms for different stakeholders to hold discussions about how the internet should be used for the betterment of society, and for them to decide to hold it in Ethiopia, in a country that has weaponized internet, that has cut off an entire people, the Tigray people, for 2 years, in an attempt to silence them, to deny them of any means of expression, to deny journalists from going to Tigray and cover and shed light into the extraordinary atrocities unleashed by Ethiopian and Eritrean, for the UN body to decide to hold the forum in Ethiopia has really shocked me and angered me in equal measure. But in another sense, I wasn't really surprised because, like I alluded to, the Internet Governance Forum is a UN body, and we have seen how different UN bodies in Ethiopia have been used by the Ethiopian regime as weapons against the Tigray people. We could mention the World Food Program, which has been used to issue statements extremely favorable to the Ethiopian regime, to say that aid is flowing to Tigray when in fact nothing is getting to Tigray, to exaggerate crimes that they say have been committed by the Tigray Defense Forces. We all remember how the WFP chief lied by saying that Tigray forces have looted WFP warehouses in Mekelle, when in fact what happened was Tigray forces took field that they had lent the WFP. And we could mention the UN women body in Addis Ababa. One of the women in top positions said in the beginning of 2020, maybe 2 or 3 weeks into the war, that the reporters of sexual violence and the reporters of rape in Tigray were exaggerated. And we could mention a number of other UN bodies based in Addis, how they have been behaving, how they have been towing the Abiy regime line. So in that sense, it wasn't a surprise. This is another UN body that has been co-opted by the Abiy regime to be used for propaganda purposes for the regime, to suppress the ground forces, to pretend that nothing is happening in Tigray. So my initial reaction was anger and shock, but through a moment of reflection, I wasn't really surprised in the light of how the UN has generally been used by Abiy and Isaias regime.
How can you explain the impact of the communication blackout in the war on Tigray and the atrocities that were being committed?
Well, it's very, very difficult to calculate the amount of damage that internet shutdown must have caused in Tigray. But I will start with an article that I wrote, I think sometime maybe 6 or 7 months ago, about the impact of the internet in Tigray. And I mentioned about how the internet has devastated Tigray. And I mentioned how startup businesses have gone bankrupt, really startup businesses who used to hire hundreds of people. I mentioned how e-learning, which was the main the main mechanism at Makale University for conducting research and learning, was brought to a halt. I mentioned how other startups like Tigray hiking group. I'm sure you remember, they were a group of volunteers who went around Tigray, who wrote about different Tigrayan artifacts, Tigrayan touristic destinations, and different Tigrayan attractions. They couldn't do their job because they didn't have internet, but also there was no safe place to travel. I mentioned about how Tigray Codes, this was again another group of volunteers who went around Tigrayan high schools teaching kids to code. They had enormous potential and promise to transform Tigray education by teaching kids how to program, how to code, but they were unable to continue their work because internet was cut off, but also, like I said earlier, there was no safe place that they could go. But also, students who were doing research in collaboration with outside universities were totally cut off from their connections, so they couldn't continue doing their research. Different students who were preparing, who were ready to go for scholarships, for exchange programs, for different experience sharing programs to other places in Ethiopia, but also to outside countries, were denied that wonderful opportunity. One of the opportunities that you really want to use as a young student is an opportunity to go out and experience and do research and go and do a degree or master's or PhD. All those opportunities have been taken away from Tigray. And the other impact of the internet shutdown is Tigrayans have been denied of a mechanism to check their souls. All the atrocities, the war crimes, and the crimes against humanity that have been vouched even by UN, and I said that the UN has been on the whole sympathetic to Ethiopia, Tigrayans couldn't report, and not just Tigrayans, but any other journalists couldn't report really because of the cutoff, because of the shutdown of internet. So it's incalculable the amount of damage that internet shutdown must have unleashed in Tigray. But I think I must emphasize the point that whatever one could say about the impact of the internet shutdown from outside, like myself or journalists, it can only be the tip of the iceberg, because we simply don't know the amount of damage, the depth of damage that internet shutdown and the telecommunication shutdown generally, and electricity and the other shutdowns must have wrought on Tigray.
Teklay, do you think this forum will bring world's attention to the war in Tigray?
I don't have trust in the UN bodies generally. There are some people who perhaps naively expect that the conference, the forum, might raise the issue of Tigray, and that might be an opportunity to bring attention to the internet shutdown in Tigray. That is one way of seeing the forum. That's one kind of optimistic expectation, but judging by experience, judging by how the UN bodies have been used for the past 2 years, I don't really expect that the Tigray issue would be mentioned in Addis Ababa. So I can't see how the forum might bring positive change. But I do, in my moments of naivete, I do keep hoping that they would raise, at the very least, that there's something wrong happening in Tigray. Especially, there are some people who are on the whole good in the board. So, for instance, Abid, you will have read that one of the board members of the forum is a lady called Maria if I'm not wrong, I think Melia Mesa. She's a Nobel Prize laureate for journalism. She's a Philippines, and she defied the regime and spoke up against the regime of the Philippines, and it's a murderous regime. So it's not an easy thing what she did 2 years ago. And she knows how regimes generally weaponize the internet. So I do keep hoping that people like her might force the panelists to speak about what's happening in Tigray. But that's a very, very faint hope because, like I said, it's a UN body, and the UN has, on the whole, been more than happy to toe the Ethiopian regime's lines. So I do keep hoping that something good might happen. But if I'm honest with you, I'm generally not expecting that they would raise the Tigray issue in the forum. But we still must continue to ask Tigrayans and people who understand the sense of justice and people who understand how the internet has been weaponized in Tigray must continue pushing for the UN, for the forum, for the Internet Governance Forum, to at the very least give people an opportunity to speak about Tigray, give Tigrayans a voice at the forum. So we're going to continue doing that. But I am very, very pessimistic about them raising the Tigray issue on their own volition.
Last week, Ethiopia's technology minister defended Ethiopia's role as a host, saying Ethiopia's freedom of expression right now is imperiled in its history and that reforms are being undertaken by her government. What can you say about freedom of expression in Ethiopia at this time and moment?
Well, I think that's, of course, a ridiculous thing to say for the Ethiopian minister, but that doesn't surprise me. Ethiopian ministers are not strangers to say extremely stupid and ridiculous things. But after all, we're talking about a country where the prime minister said that not even a single Tigrayan civilian had been killed. I think he said that sometime in the beginning of 2021, when everybody knew that thousands of people have been murdered, civilians have been murdered, not least by Eritrean troops. So I wouldn't take anything that Ethiopian officials, Ethiopian ministers, or Ethiopian politicians say. But for her to say that Ethiopia is an example of a country that respects its freedom of expression is laughable. I mean, if you are a journalist in Ethiopia and if you said anything that is even remotely critical, not just of Abiy, not just of the Ethiopian regime, but even of a foreign country like Eritrea, you end up being in jail. That's how bad freedom of expression in Ethiopia is. If you said something that is even remotely negative of Isaias, which appears to me is running the show from behind the scenes. If you say something negative about him, you go to jail. So that is how slavish Ethiopia has become, and that is how repressive Ethiopia has become in terms of freedom of expression. And also, I think there was a report by, I think it's the Open Society Forum, that conducts research about different countries' degree of to what degree do they respect freedom of expression. And I think Ethiopia is in the top 5 in terms of being a jailer of journalists. So it's an extremely repressive regime. But if we could ask the big question: if it had any sort of love for freedom of expression, why not open the internet in Tigray? Why not open the possibility for journalists to go and report in Tigray? Why that is so afraid of anybody going to Tigray and reporting something? So that just tells you how Ethiopia is afraid of information, how Ethiopia is afraid of the truth coming out to light. It's not just in Tigray, actually. It's also in different parts of Oromia. They continue to impose total blockade on information, on telecommunications, so that no one gets access to the areas. Why? Because the regime is scared that if what is happening was to be seen by different people, it would be negative coverage to the regime. So Ethiopia is an extremely repressive regime. It doesn't have any right to speak about freedom of expression. And for the minister to have said that Ethiopia is an example of freedom of expression is a travesty of of justice, actually.
But the minister says her government is undertaking reforms and it even releases political prisoners and journalists when it first assumes power.
There is a trick that all repressive dictatorial regimes do, which is that they would jail, for instance, 100 people and they release one, and they ask you to celebrate the release of one rather than to lament the arrest of 99 journalists. So what Ethiopia did in, I think, 2018 was, yes, journalists were, although I would take exception to the characterization that all of them were journalists, but anyway, a decision was made before Abiy came to power to release all politicians, all high-profile journalists and people who were involved in different forms of activism. A decision was made through the, I think, in one of the conferences of the EPRDF, of the now defunct EPRDF. So it wasn't a decision that the current regime took. It was a decision that had been taken by the previous regime in an attempt to mollify the Oromo protesters and also the different protesters that were erupting throughout the country. And yes, people were released. But what happened was people who continued to be critical of the regime was rearrested. But people who became friendly to the regime, and most of the people who were released in 2018 end up being extremely friendly to the regime, were not released. And then the regime has been towing the line that it has released some journalists in 2018, when in fact it has jailed a lot of journalists just in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia. I'm not even mentioning the fact that they went to Tigray. And Abin, you would know your colleague, you would remind me his name. They went to his house and they murdered him for doing his journalism. And they silenced all Tigrayan journalists based in Addis. So for a regime that goes around and murders journalists because they say something that is not favorable to it, for it to say that it's respecting freedom of expression and journalism is ludicrous and laughable.
Okay, finally, Teklay, what do you think should be done to reconnect Tigray?
Well, I think in the light of the discussion that we are having in terms of the Internet Governance Forum, I think serious people in the body, in the UN body, in the Internet Governance Forum, should use this as an opportunity to make the point to the Ethiopian regime that it should open internet in Tigray, that it should lift the communication blockade on Tigray, that this is no way to govern people, that this is barbaric to try to commit atrocities in total darkness. So I would make a clarion call to people in the Internet Governance Forum to make that point to the Ethiopian regime. Not that the point hasn't been made to the regime repeatedly by different bodies, but I think they now have finally an opportunity to make that point in Addis Ababa in the form of a forum. Actually, the decision to hold the forum in Addis Ababa was extremely misguided and mistaken, but they could salvage something if they made sure that Tigray is the center of attention or took center stage in the forum. If they discussed the issue of Tigray and how internet has been used as a weapon, how starvation has been used as a weapon, how the repression of journalists have been used as the weapon. If they talk about those issues in Addis Ababa, I think they will have done themselves some justice. So we in the Tigrayan community and different people who are interested in activism, in advocacy, must push for the IGF to do something meaningful in Addis. That is one thing. But also, I think in the spirit of the agreement signed between the Ethiopian regime and the Tigrayan authorities, I think it's about time for the Ethiopian regime to respect its end of the bargain. It had agreed that it would open communication lines. It had agreed that it would create unfettered access for humanitarian aid. It had agreed that it wouldn't target Tigrayans in any way or form. And about time that it respected those commitments. And I think people in different capacities, people in different spheres of life must push for the regime to respect those. And I think I would say that the Tigrayan authorities, the Tigrayan government, must demand persistently, maybe even on a daily basis, if that is what is required, for the Ethiopian regime to lift the siege on Tigray. So that is what I think we should do. But my final message would be for the forum, for the people who organize the forum, to use the opportunity to convey the important point that internet has been used to commit. Maybe they wouldn't agree with the characterization that genocide has been committed, but even by UN account, war crime and crimes against humanity have been committed in Tigray. And a huge part of the weapon used to achieve those two ends has been the shutdown of the internet. And they have to make that point. It was a mistaken decision to hold it in Addis. It was a mistaken decision to work in collaboration with the regime. It was a mistaken decision for Daudi FP, for the UN Women's Body, for the other UN bodies in Addis to have been working closely with Abiy. It was a total mistake, but they now have an opportunity to redeem themselves by doing something righteous.
Teklay, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Okay, our viewers, this were all for today's session. Until next time, bye-bye.